the country that had nothing and bought itself everything. In 1965, a country was kicked out of a union it didn't want to leave. No army worth mentioning. No oil. No coal. No gold. Not even enough drinking water to keep its own people alive without help from a neighbor that didn't much like it. Its own prime minister cried on live television, announcing the separation, because he knew exactly how bad the odds were. 60 years later, that same country has a higher income per person than the United States, Japan, and Germany. It didn't find a hidden oil field. It didn't get lucky. It did something almost every other country with nothing has failed to do. This is how Singapore turned scarcity into its greatest asset, and why the story isn't as simple as the postcards make it look. Picture the checklist you'd want before building a wealthy nation. Land, ideally a lot of it. A large domestic market to sell things to. Natural resources to export. Friendly neighbors to trade with. In 1965, Singapore had none of those boxes checked. It's smaller than New York City. It had almost no fresh water of its own, most of it piped in from Malaysia, the same country it had just split from, under less than warm terms. It had no oil, no minerals, barely any farmland, and its population was a patchwork of ethnic groups, languages, and recent immigrants with no shared national identity to build on. Economists at the time didn't expect Singapore to fail gently. Some expected it to fail completely. So, the country's leadership made a decision that looked strange on paper. Instead of trying to become self-sufficient, they decided to make Singapore indispensable to everyone else. If you have nothing the world needs, you make yourself something the world can't route around. Singapore couldn't sell resources it didn't have. So, it sold something else: reliability. In the 1960s, much of Southeast Asia was unstable. Coups, wars, and shifting alliances made investors nervous. Singapore's government offered the opposite: predictable law, enforced contracts, minimal corruption at a time when corruption was the norm across the region. A government that stayed in power long enough to keep its promises. That predictability became the product. Multinational companies didn't come to Singapore because labor was the cheapest in Asia. It usually wasn't. They came because a factory built today wouldn't be nationalized, seized, or shut down by political chaos next year. The government backed this up with aggressive tax incentives for foreign manufacturers, and by the late 1960s, companies were setting up electronics and shipbuilding plants on reclaimed land that, a decade earlier, had been swamped. Reclaimed land. That detail matters more than it sounds. Singapore has physically grown by roughly 25% in landmass since independence, pulling sand from the sea floor and from neighboring countries to build the ground its airport, ports, and financial district now sit on. A country that started with too little land responded by manufacturing more of it. By the late 1960s, Singapore had a labor problem that had nothing to do with skill or effort. Roughly a third of its population lived in slum settlements or overcrowded shophouses, and unemployment sat above 10%. Strikes were common, not because workers were unreasonable, but because they had almost nothing to lose. The government's answer wasn't a wage hike. It was ownership. The Housing and Development Board began mass building apartment blocks and selling them to citizens at subsidized rates, financed through a mandatory national savings scheme workers paid into throughout their careers. Within roughly 2 decades, home ownership went from a rarity to the norm for the vast majority of citizens. A person who owns their home, and who is paying into a fund tied to their own long-term stability, behaves differently at the bargaining table than someone with nothing to lose. Strikes became rare. Labor unrest, which had scared off investors in the 1960s, largely disappeared by the 1970s. It's worth sitting with what this really was. The government didn't just build housing. It built a citizenry with a financial stake in the country's stability. before asking that citizenry to accept a demanding, export-driven economic model. Here's the part most retellings of the Singapore story skip. In 1985, the formula broke. Singapore fell into its first recession since independence. Wages had been pushed up faster than productivity could justify. Manufacturing costs rose, and the low-cost factory model that had carried the country for 2 decades stopped being competitive against cheaper neighbors. The government's response is arguably more instructive than anything that came before it. It admitted the model was outdated and rebuilt it. State-owned monopolies in telecommunications and other sectors were open to competition. Financial services and banking regulations were loosened to attract global capital, not just factories. The government began actively courting corporate regional headquarters, not just manufacturing floors, but decision-making centers. That shift is the reason Singapore's economy today looks almost nothing like it did in 1985. Services now make up more than 70% of GDP, and manufacturing, once the backbone, has shrunk to a supporting role. A country that had already reinvented itself once, from swamp to factory floor, reinvented itself again, from factory floor to financial hub. Here's where the story gets uncomfortable, and where a lot of Singapore success content stops early. Singapore is now consistently ranked among the most expensive cities on earth to live in, not because life there is comfortable, but because of a specific, engineered scarcity. There is almost no more land to build on, and car ownership is deliberately taxed into luxury good territory to control congestion on an island with nowhere to expand. The median worker in Singapore takes home a solid but unspectacular salary by rich country standards, and roughly a fifth of every paycheck is diverted automatically into mandatory savings accounts the worker doesn't fully control. Funds earmarked for housing, healthcare, and retirement, whether the worker wants that allocation that month or not. Meanwhile, Singapore has one of the highest concentrations of millionaires per capita anywhere in the world. Both of those facts are true about the same small island at the same time. Inequality, measured by the Gini coefficient, remains higher in Singapore than in most other wealthy nations. Worse than the UK, Japan, and Germany, though better than the United States. A widely discussed local study found something uncomfortable. Singaporeans who grew up in public housing and those who grew up in private housing tend to have surprisingly little social overlap with each other, despite living on the same small island. The success is real. The GDP numbers are real. But rich country and every resident feels rich turn out to be two very different claims, and Singapore's government has openly called shrinking the gap one of its top unresolved priorities. It's tempting to tell this story as a simple one: tiny country, smart policy, instant riches. That version sells well, but it isn't quite honest. The real story is a country that kept running out of the thing it needed most: land, water, labor peace, competitiveness, and instead of accepting the shortage, kept manufacturing a substitute for it. No land? Build land. No stable workforce? Give people a stake in stability. No competitive industry? Rebuild the industry. No goodwill with the region? Become too useful to ignore. What Singapore never had was the luxury of standing still. Every advantage it has today was manufactured under pressure, not inherited. That's a very different story then. An island got lucky with its location. Location was the opening move. Everything after that was decades of forced reinvention, and it isn't finished. The next chapter, on inequality and cost of living, is one Singapore is still writing. If a country with almost no natural resources can out-earn nations sitting on oil fields, the interesting question isn't, how did they get lucky? It's, what did they refuse to accept as a permanent shortage? What's a country you think pulled off something similar, turned a weakness into its whole identity? Drop it in the comments, I'm building a list for a future video. And if you want the next one on how Singapore is trying to fix the inequality problem it built along the way, subscribe. That one's coming next.